blind, and I'm trying to treat it as a new adventure, which I manage to do most of the time, but not all the time. When people say to me, "Your attitude is wonderful," I feel I have to say to them, sometimes the air is a little bit blue in my house as I trip over things or drop things or whatever. So tonight I want to talk about women who founded Christianity. Now this may seem an extraordinary bonkers statement to you, because we all have a storyline in our head about Christianity, that Jesus came, chose 12 men led by Peter, and they went on and ordained others, etc. And it's all a male story. And it's astonishing to me, actually, how we read scripture and don't really see what's there, or how we relate Christian stories that aren't really true. And I find that astonishing. I do it myself, and it's only, recently, as I've begun to reflect, well, recently, the last 20, 30 years, that I've discovered the anomalies and the contradictions and the paradoxes that are part of our story of Christianity. So I'm going to start off immediately with how women founded Christianity. We know, basically, Jesus came, and he lived, and he died. We know the story of Jesus well, so I don't need to go into it. But when he died, this is Mark's gospel. I'm sitting especially on Mark's shoulders tonight and dealing with Mark's gospel. When Jesus died, Mark tells us, and I'm going to say the Greek because Mark wrote his gospel in Greek, just so you'll know I'm not making it up, Mark says, "Aphentes auton effugan pantes." Now, aphentes auton means they deserted him. These are his closest friends, the 12 apostles, led by Peter and Andrew, his brother. Do you know the names of the 12 apostles? I learned them in national school here. So all of the apostles and disciples, all of the male apostles and disciples abandoned him. And effugan pantes means they all ran away. So now here we are in the life of Jesus, as Mark is telling it in chapter 14, if you want to check. And he tells us that Jesus is dead and all his disciples have abandoned him. All of them have aphentes auton, deserted him, and run away. So it took me a long time, and whenever I say this and point it out at meetings, people say, I never noticed that. Like, we read the Gospel of Mark during Lent, and they never noticed that he was abandoned by all his apostles. So how did we get here? How did Christianity start if none of the people that we thought founded it actually founded it? And so we come to the end of chapter 14, and then we almost come to the end of chapter 15 of Mark, when he says, and I'm going to say it in Greek again, so you know I won't be making it up, Eisande kai gunaikes apomakreten. And there were women there, gunaikes, and there were women there standing at a distance. Now Mark doesn't say, so it was the women actually who founded Christianity. He doesn't say that. What he does say is that among these women were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and I love this phrase, Paulai alai, many other women. And so I often sit at home and say to myself, how many women are many other women? There were many other women there. And then he tells us, because he'd never mentioned it before, that these had been with him all the time. They had been disciples, they had followed him up from Galilee to Jerusalem, and here they were at the foot of the cross. And so if there is any connection, whatever, between the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus and us and Christianity, It's only through the women, because they were the only people who were there. And so in my head for years now I've been saying, thank you to these women for founding Christianity. So, like, the men weren't there. They had run away. That's what Mark tells us. And now the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke and John, are a little more gentle with them, you know. They're a little kinder. But Mark is supposed to be, the Gospels, of course, are Gospels. They're not history. But Mark's Gospel is the earliest Gospel. It was written in the year 70. That's 40 years after the death of Jesus. And it's a Gospel that's supposed to be the most historic. The other Gospels are gospel, that's proclamations of faith. But Mark's Gospel is also a proclamation of faith, but it's the most historic of the Gospels. And so Mark tells us then that it was the women who were there. And so we go back to the beginning. So Jesus died, and for 25 years, it seems that men and women mixed together in Christianity. It's astonishing to me, actually, how little we know about the early days of Christianity. We don't really know what happened in those 25 years. Like, we know that his followers must have been there. Jesus had died. And they went all over the place. Like, Christianity spread rapidly through the Mediterranean, up to Rome and all that kind of thing. But in the year 55, it's kind of the end of the story for women. Because in the year 55, Paul is writing his letters. And Paul writes letters to the Corinthians. And in the year 55, in his first letter, chapter 14, to the Corinthians, he says, "Let the women be silent in the churches." Now, when I was in boarding school in Bunclody, the nuns used to say that that was to tell the women not to be whispering during Mass. And of course, which of course was absolutely ridiculous, because they didn't have Mass back then apart from anything else. But "let the women be silent in the churches" is much more dramatic, much more desperate for women than that, because what it meant is that from that time on, the Christian church did not need to pay any attention to women. And so from the year 55 right up to the year 1970, there is nothing of women in Christianity officially. Officially, from that time on, from the year 55, well, even up to today, actually, for the Catholic Church, there is nothing of women. Women's thoughts are not important. How women prayed wasn't important. There is the odd person, which I'm going to mention, do a little sort of thumbnail history of women in a minute. But from the year 55 to the year 1970, Christianity is a male religion. It is led by men, it's taught by men, the liturgy is male, theology is male, scripture is male. Like, that's obvious. It's naming the obvious. And somebody once said to me, the most radical thing you can do is to name the obvious. And it's amazing to me how we sort of don't notice that. We don't pay attention. We don't realize that it's totally male. Now, I also want to say that from 55 to 1970, millions upon millions upon millions of women and men, but I want to talk about women in particular, lived in Christianity, loved Christianity, became holy in this version of Christianity. And even though there was nothing, they were never asked, women were never asked, "What do you think of God?" Never. In all that time, 2,000 years almost, nobody, no pope, no cardinal, no bishop ever thought of asking women, "So who is God for you, you know? What do you think of God?" But as I say, women loved Christianity, became holy, accepted it the way it was, and wended their own way, in their own way, through Christianity even though it was a totally male experience. Now, it was a brilliant, this isn't against men, it was a brilliant male experience. The Christian institution that we have inherited, the Catholic Church that we have inherited, is a brilliant institution. When we think of the beauty of the liturgy, the beauty of the architecture, the beauty of the music, the beauty of the art, like I'm fully aware of all of that. I love it. I've read it, you know. I've read all of the basic texts because this was part of my doctorate many, many years ago in the middle 60s, which is a long time ago. When I was doing my doctorate, I had to, it was in Greek and Latin as the person who was introducing me said, which surprised me. I'd almost forgotten that. Like I read Augustine and Ambrose and Jerome and John Chrysostom and Basil and Gregory of Nazianzus. I don't know if you've ever heard of all these people, but I read all of those in Latin and Greek, and so I was very familiar with their writings and loved them. So I'm very familiar with male Christianity, but always back then I was asking myself, where are the women? Like, do they have nothing to offer? Doesn't anybody ask them, who are you? You know, where are you? What's happening? So anyway, I said 1970 is the end. So from 55 through all of those years, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the church was a male church. And that's fine. Like, I don't even want to use the word male-dominated church, but all the popes were male, like you know yourself, it was a male church. It was led by men, it was taught by men, all the theology was done by men, all the liturgy was done by men, as is still the case in the Catholic Church, of course. And so just after the Second Vatican Council, the bishops who were at the Second Vatican Council from the year 63 to the year 65 realized when they came to the end of the council, which was true, that they hadn't mentioned women. And this is extraordinary in the 60s. They had, and if you read the documents of Vatican II, they're all about men. Like, they're beautiful. I've read them. I used to teach them. I used to know whole chunks of them off by heart, which doesn't happen anymore because when you turn 80, your memory plays tricks on you, you know. So if I disappear for a few minutes, you'll know what's happening. But after the council, in 62 to 65, they realized that they hadn't mentioned women. And so the Pope said to them, I'm putting this question to you. When Paul said, let the women be silent in the churches, did he mean, and he's giving them two questions, did he mean that this was the word of God, which it was because it was scripture, but is it divine positive law? Divine positive law is the phrase we used to use for the teaching of scripture and the teaching of Christianity that can't be changed, that was understood to come directly from the mind of God. So let the women be silent in the churches, is that divine positive law? Or is it a pastoral decision made by Paul in Corinth? Again, we were told that the women were tittering in the church. So is it a pastoral decision made by Paul in Corinth? And because it's a pastoral decision, I'll tell you what pastoral means in a minute, can it be changed in another place and in another time by another pastoral decision? And so the bishops who were all collected together, the scripture scholars I mean, who were all collected together said, this is the second one. It's a pastoral decision made by Paul and so can be changed in another place and at another time. Now what does pastoral mean? Pastoral means that it's a decision made by pastors for their community. It's not a law that comes down from God. It's not divine positive law. It's a pastoral decision that's there for the benefit of the community. And so after the council in 65, when the scripture scholars said, this is the latter, it is my mind, sorry, it's the teaching of the pastoral decision made by Paul and can be changed. And so what they did, what the Catholic Church did, which is what we're talking about now, what the Catholic Church did was to say, why don't we make Therese of Avila and Catherine of Siena doctors of the Church? Now what happened? Now if I had been the Pope, I'd have got out on my little balcony and done a dance and rung my bell and said, listen people, everything has changed. The Catholic Church now teaches that women can teach in the church, that women are allowed by God to teach, because that's the change. But that's not what he did. What they did was to make Therese of Avila and Catherine of Siena doctors of the church, a symbolic statement. Now the Catholic Church is really good at making symbolic statements. So what happened? Instead of the whole world saying, oh my God, this is extraordinary, now women can teach in the church, now we can get the whole thing organized, and men have that teaching and women can have this teaching, and we can all talk to each other. Nothing happened. Nobody, I think I was the only person in the whole Catholic Church who noticed that something extraordinary had happened. Like I never saw it in anybody else's literature. Hardly anybody else ever said it. Well, nobody else ever said it. And so we have this extraordinary situation where Therese of Avila, who, as you know, lived from 1515 to 1582 in the 16th century and was an extraordinary woman, and Catherine of Siena, who lived in the 14th century, 1347 to 1380. Don't mind, I have a funny head for dates. I remember every date. I can't remember what I said 2 minutes ago, but I remember dates. So Catherine of Siena, who was quite an extraordinary woman, and Therese of Avila, who was an equally extraordinary, if not more extraordinary woman, they were the people who were now doctors of the church. Now what does that mean? It means that their teaching, the teaching of Catherine of Siena and the teaching of Therese of Avila, were as important as the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, of Augustine, of Ambrose, of Jerome, of Basil, and all that, but nobody noticed. I don't think anybody ever even bothered reading the teachings of even the Carmelites when I used to talk to them. They said, oh really, is that true? You know, that their founders' teachers, Therese of Avila's teachings and Catherine of Siena's teachings, were as significant for the church as the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, etc. And still today, I would say, I don't know how many of you have spent your bedtime hours reading Catherine of Siena and Therese of Avila. Probably not very many, but I don't know. But it's technically the teaching of the church that their teachings is as important as the teachings of the big names in the church, Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, Aquinas, etc. And now we have two more. We have 4 women doctors of the church altogether. In 1997, Pope John Paul II made Therese of Lisieux a doctor of the church because it was the 100th anniversary of her death. She died aged 24 in 1897. And in 1997, 100 years later, Pope John Paul, who loved her, made her a doctor of the church. Now, I have to admit, I don't know why she's a doctor of the church. As you know, we have her book, The Story of a Soul, but it's not exactly high theology. It's beautiful. It's beautiful meditative writing and all that. And then the final one is Hildegard of Bingen. Eventually, now we have Therese of Avila, who is a Spanish, Catherine of Siena, who is Italian, Therese of Lisieux, who is French, and Benedict becomes Pope, and he's German. And he says, enough of that, we need a German doctor of the church. And so he makes Hildegard of Bingen a doctor of the church. I don't know if you know very much about Hildegard of Bingen, and she deserves to be a doctor of the church. She lived from 1098 to 1179, so throughout most of the 12th century. She was a Benedictine abbess, an extraordinary woman who sort of strode across Europe at that time and was looked up to by everybody. And so we now have 4 women doctors of the church whose writings are theoretically foundationally important for understanding Christianity. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent your time reading Thomas Aquinas and all these people either, but their writings have kind of been integrated into our understanding of doctrine and all that kind of thing. And so, we have absorbed them even though we're not even aware that we're absorbing their teaching. But the writings of Therese of Avila, Catherine, and Therese of Lisieux and Hildegard of Bingen, they're probably unknown to most of you. And I would suggest that you get don't read them yourself. They're difficult to read, except for Therese of Lisieux. But get little groups together sometime if you're interested and want to find out what they're saying and see what they're talking about. So that's when I say women founded the church, what I mean is the men weren't there, they had run away, only the women were there, and then I'm bringing us up to date to the present time where we have 4 women doctors of the church. There are about 30 male doctors of the church. You probably know all their names, Thomas Aquinas and all these people. I'm going to knock this over one of these minutes. And so give yourself a treat sometime and get together with a group of people and just sort of page through the writings of these women, because they're profoundly important and in fact they're beautiful. So what I want to do now is go back to the beginning and talk a little bit about what happened to the women. Like, where were they? What happened to their story? And so from 55, as I said, the year 55, that's not 1955, the year 55, 25 years after the death of Jesus, to 1970, when Therese of Avila and Catherine were made doctors of the church, there was almost nothing of women in Christianity, but the women were there. There was nothing official. Christianity was officially male. So what I want to do now is pick out a few moments throughout the history of Christianity and talk a little bit about the women who were there. And I'm jumping now to the 4th century. And it's interesting, there's kind of a pattern throughout Christianity that every now and then Christianity got a little haywire, and all the theologians got together and nailed down the theology and said, this is what you have to believe, this is the main teaching, these are the doctrines, don't change them. And whenever that happened, and everything seemed to be nailed down, and the men were kind of relaxing and saying, we finally got Christianity sorted, out of nowhere, or as we would say, out of left field, the women come and start contradicting it. Extraordinary. So in the 4th century, as you know, the 4th century was an extraordinary, they call it the golden age of Christianity. The 4th and 5th centuries, there's Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, all of the basic doctrines of grace and sacrament and God and Jesus and all that become part of our creed, become part of the basic doctrine of the church, and it hasn't changed for all of the Christian denominations. And so these doctrines are nailed down, they're all about men, and out of the blue, without any forewarning, we have women who begin to found religious communities. We have women like Paula the Elder and her daughter Paula the Younger, of course, in Rome. We have Marcella. We have women in Rome, women in Greece, women all over the place who begin to get women together and to teach women's theology. And they really challenged the church. The church was terrified of these women. And they challenged the teaching of the men, and they they said, no, this is what God is to us. God to us is, and their teaching was always more poetic. Like one of them said, I swim towards the shore, only to find that you have enlarged the sea. Then you give me more desire and strengthen my muscles to swim again towards you. Isn't that beautiful? I like, the sea keeps getting bigger and bigger, and Christianity and God is getting bigger and bigger and moving further away from us. And so that's really where they want to direct our attention. So women's teaching was always more inward. Men's teaching was always more outward. For example, men loved, and again, I'm not knocking, like this is the foundations of Christianity, and it's extremely important, so I'm not knocking it. But men's Christianity was propositional. They loved making statements. They loved saying things like, God is the supreme Lord and Master of heaven and earth. You know, that kind of statement? They loved putting God outside themselves, up there. Even God is love. And so when we say God is love, like everything changes. It gives the impression we kind of know who God is, and the notion of love becomes divine, and therefore human love is kind of reduced in importance, and married love becomes reduced in importance. So it's quite extraordinary what happens. So when they're saying God is love, that's what men say. They make statements. What women say, what the women mystics and the 4th century women say, love is who God is. So do you see the difference? What the women are saying, when you say love, we know that. We know what love is. We know the love of husband and wife. We know the love of lovers. We know the love of parents for children and children for parents. We know the love of gay people. They wouldn't have said that back then, but I'm saying it today. We know what love is. And so whenever you experience love, you experience God. So do you see the difference between male-dominated teaching, which is essential, I'm not knocking it, it's essential to Christianity because we need to know what the church teaches, and then women tend to go inwards. They tend to say, love is who God is. When I love, when I experience love, when I discover love, then I discover God. That's an extraordinary statement. It's only gradually through the history of Christianity that we began to realize, because much of Christianity is the male statements, the male propositions, and the male creeds, and the male dogmas, and all of that kind of thing. And then the women tend to go inward and invite us to say, okay, what is love? And whenever we find love, whenever we find truth, whenever we find beauty, that's where we find God. So what I want to do now, that's women in the 4th century. It's the beginning of women's religious communities. It's the beginning of nuns, if you like. And it terrified the church because women started speaking out of their own experience. And what the church did, I'm talking Pope, cardinals, bishops, when I say church, is to found religious communities and put people back into religious communities so they couldn't mix with the ordinary people. And so all of these women in religious communities were virgins. Now I want to say, I hope I don't get too distracted about this because I do want to do the Middle Ages and further, all the women we know about in Christianity are virgins. So that means women who are not involved in sex. There is very little in Christianity about marriage, about mothers, about wives, about women who engaged in sexuality legitimately, in legitimate marriage. They sort of had a feeling that this was a little bit sinful, you know. And so there's very little history, very little attention paid to married women, to wives, to mothers throughout Christian history. We have loads of information about virgins. We can trace the history of virgins right down the age, but they weren't interested in mothers. In fact, they treated mothers as if they were minors, as if they were not full human beings. Men were full human beings, but women who engaged in sex weren't. So it's quite extraordinary when you go back through history and try to find out, wonder what marriage was like in the 4th century or whatever. It's very difficult to find that out. So I want to jump now from the 4th century right up to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are roundabout from 1150 to 1450, that 300 years. Extraordinarily rich period in history. But what's happening, I said, you know, when men get things organized and think they have everything under control, what happens is that the women burst out and contradict everything. So in the Middle Ages, you had what is called scholasticism. You had Thomas Aquinas and the universities and teaching theology and kind of the birth of theology and theology schools and the writing out of theology, who is God, you know, all of these extraordinary mountains of Christian literature about who God is and what we should be doing and what grace is and what the sacraments are and all that kind of thing. So in the Middle Ages you have a huge growth in the intellectual understanding of Christian teaching, of male Christian teaching. A huge growth. So scholasticism is the name of it. It's called Scholastic Theology. It's the theology taught in schools, and it was taught in a very organized and practical way in the universities, which were founded at that time all by Christian leaders. So we have university theology developing, and what happens is, and it's all male because women weren't allowed to go to these universities, it's all male, and what happens is the women say, well, what about us? And it's out of that experience that we get the wonderful period of medieval women mystics. Now I want to tell you what a mystic is and what mysticism is. Mysticism is the experience of direct contact with God. In Christianity, especially in the Catholic Church, we're very good for mediation, that God is mediated to us through the priests, through the sacraments, through the scriptures, through the saints, that we're not encouraged to go directly to God. But these women went directly. They had a direct experience of God. They experienced God directly in their own lives, which is quite an extraordinary thing that happened. And you have people like Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Genoa, Marguerite Porete, who was burned at the stake, extraordinary women, many of whom were executed because they claimed to be able to speak for God. They claimed to be able to speak from their hearts about who God is. And so mystical theology is theology that lets us go directly to God. And the mystic is the person who can speak to God directly, who experiences a relationship with God directly. Now, of course, this terrified the church, because what it meant is that these women mystics bypassed the clergy. The clergy had just got all organized, all the priests, the sacrament of ordination, all of these things were organized, all the priests were organized, all the more or less the parishes were organized, and bishops and everything. And along come these women mystics, And they bypass the whole thing and go directly to God. This is why many of them were executed, many of them were burnt at the stake, but they said extraordinary things like, and this is one of my favorite statements of all the women, this is Hildegard of Bingen. She said, "I am a feather on the breath of God." It's a beautiful statement. I am a feather on the breath of God. And the other one, I'm only mentioning a few here, Catherine of Genoa, who is a 13th century mystic. By the way, nobody wrote down the history of these women because they didn't think women were that important. So even today, when we're trying to study women through the history of Christianity, it's very difficult because nobody wrote down their story. Nobody thought it was important enough. And so Catherine of Genoa, this is one of my favorite little tiny statements in the whole of Christianity. She said, "My real me is God." Now what is she talking about? She's saying, even back then in the 13th century, my real me, that is my humanity, the core of my humanity is divinity. It's an extraordinary statement. Even for today, you really have to sit down and think about that. When I'm talking about God, I don't have to go off up there. I can go in here. The core of my being as a woman, the core of my being as a human being is humanity, is divinity. So God is at the center of my being. Do you see the change? Obviously, it's not denying that God, I don't know why I'm pointing up there, but you know what I mean. Somewhere. God is somewhere out there or up there or somewhere. That's sort of the Christian teaching, that God is beyond all knowledge and beyond, God is mystery. And so the core of Christian teaching is that God is beyond all knowledge. But then the women mystics say, my real me is God. When I talk about God, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about the core of my being. I'm talking about the essence of humanity is divinity. Now this sounds like an extraordinarily modern thing to say today. It could even be seen as heretical today. But this is from the Middle Ages on, from this period of the women mystics, we have this extraordinary insight that the core of our being, the core of our humanity is divinity. So that's the Middle Ages. I'm jumping now to the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent, as you know, was called in 1545 because the Protestant tradition was galloping through Europe. Martin Luther and all of the Lutheran tradition and all the Protestant traditions were galloping through Europe, and the Pope called the Council of Trent in 1545 to pull together again what was the Christian teaching. What was the Christian teaching about women and about men. And so the Council of Trent is a very, we all grew up in the Council of Trent. We all knew our catechisms, we knew the questions and we knew the answers, and we knew that the words couldn't be changed, the words of the questions couldn't be changed, and the words of the answers couldn't be changed. It was all memorizable. We could say, I know who God is because it's in my catechism. I know what all this stuff is. And so the Council of Trent was a very practical, very organized, it was a fearful kind of council. It was trying to pull back Christianity from the brink, so to speak, and say, this is what Christianity is. If you're talking about Christianity, this is what you have to say. And so, again, Christianity seems to be nailed down, and what do the women do? The women start going on the missions. The women start founding all of the religious communities that we know today, all of the missionary communities. They start heading out to Africa and America and all of these places in the most extraordinary outpouring of European women's Christianity. Like women start moving outside. They start saying, well, this is too narrow. We can't live just with the Council of Trent's definition of Christianity. We have to move out. And so it's from this period that Christianity comes to North America, comes to Africa, comes to Australia, spreads all over the world. And of course, in all of this, Irish Christians and Irish missionaries have a huge role to play, which I can't get into now. But so the 16th century back then is the beginning of the Christianity that we're familiar with. Like every parish is organized. We know when we have to go to confession. We know when we can go to communion. It's all laid down. They don't want it to get out of commission anymore. And so all of these women's religious communities, again, as they explode in membership, they're enclosed and their rules are made sacred, and their bishops and popes and everybody, who again are terrified that the women are going to go rampant around the church or something, they make them into very tightly structured women's religious communities. And that's pretty well the church that I grew up in and that probably many of you grew up in. And we loved it. It was, we went to, the Mass was organized. We knew when we had to go to Mass. We knew everything, benediction, the saints, all of that was organized until we come then to our period, the 60s, when things begin, the 50s and 60s, when things begin to fall apart again, because women begin to say, especially after the Second Vatican Council, as I mentioned, well, where do we fit in? What is there for us? And so the whole thinking about who women are and where women fit in and who women might be in the church and who women might be before God is really important. Now, I want to point out that I'm not talking about a goddess here, like God is mystery. God is mystery. God isn't male or female, God is mystery. And so when we talk about God, I'm not talking about goddesses or anything like that. I'm talking about the mystery of God. And so when we get to our generation and we begin to look at who is God in the 60s, who is God for us, we begin to look at, to unravel some of the thinking about God that's gone on through the generations, and that brings us more or less up to our own time. When Christianity is in a way so diverse in so many ways that it's almost you can't kind of get it together. It's in so many places, so many different versions, so many teachers, so many people leaving. It's in a quite extraordinary state today, quite an extraordinary situation. So if you were to ask me, for example, where I think Christianity might be going, I have no idea. I can't say, I think it's going to go down this road, or I think it's going to go down that road. We have no idea. And so we look back on the whole history of Christianity and see the development that happened from the very beginning when Jesus came, and when it was the women were there, the women stayed. Like I ask myself, why did the men run away? Why wasn't there something in Jesus that kept them there? And I ask myself, what is it in Jesus that kept the women there? That the women were standing apomakroten in Greek, at a distance. The women were standing at a distance. And so that phrase, at a distance, is really important to me, because as a woman, I'm not a man, and I'm not a full part of the male church. The Catholic Church is a male church. That's obvious. That's not saying it's bad or nasty or anything. It's a church run by men. The teaching is by men. The liturgy is done by men. The official theology is done by men. And so where do women fit in? Now what I want to say a few words before I finish about feminist theology. Feminist theology is brilliant. I've taught it, I've read it, I love it, it's all over the place. Feminist theology is kind of looking at male theology, looking at this great structure of male theology and all its teachings and its mountains of teachings and dogmas and all that, and creeds and all that kind of thing. And it's looking at that and saying, well, from a woman's point of view, we want to challenge this. We want to say, as you know, he and she instead of just he. It's not just about men, it's also about women. But you know, what feminist theology kind of discovered is that it's impossible. You really can't feminize, or better still, womanize theology. It is so male. It is so deeply rooted in the male experience that it's almost impossible. Feminist theology realized this, that you know, we can look at the teachings and we can say, from a woman's perspective, this is what I think we ought to say. But feminist theology is not the final answer. And so for me, the final answer is woman's theology. It's us. And we haven't even started, I don't think. That we have to go into our hearts as women and say, who is God for me as a woman? Not, can I change male theology, or can I change the male version of God, which is beautiful, as I say, it's fantastic. We have our cathedrals and all that stuff. But where we have to go now from here, and we haven't even started, I don't think, this process, it's up to women, it seems to me. Male theology, I think, is running out of steam. They're like every time I turn around, the church is praying for vocations. It's running out of steam. There aren't going to be great influxes of vocations to the priesthood. That version, it's not going to die, but it's not going to grow and develop in a way that it had through the centuries. So Christianity, male Christianity, with all its wonderful teachings by men and its great male doctors of the church and all that kind of thing, is there and will always be there and will probably change a little bit, and we can always refer back to it, but I don't think it's going to grow dramatically. But what I think is going to be the next step in Christianity is women. Women are going to have to look into their own hearts and say, well, who is God for me? Where do I find God? And especially, and I want to emphasize this, I'm not, absolutely not talking about virgins here. I'm talking about ordinary, everyday women, married women. The extraordinary miracle, for example, of a woman who conceives a child and carries it in her womb for 9 months. There is no Christian meditation on that event. Why? Because men can't reflect on that event. And so women who are pregnant, in a group like this, there must be some pregnant women. I hope there are some pregnant women. They have to look inside themselves at the miracle of life that is taking place within them and say, what does this tell me about life? What does this tell me about God? This extraordinary event where a new life is being created in my being. There are two beings in one body. How do I think about that? We have to begin to, and you see, the problem is for women, we don't have a theological language. Our theological language is male. And so we're sort of starting from scratch, where we have to invent a new language. We have to have huge more respect for our own experience. Like it used to be, I remember not too long ago when lay people first started being ministers of the Eucharist, for example. This is in Canada. I was in Canada. And I remember there were about 5 women in the parish chosen to be ministers of the Eucharist. And 2 of the women were pregnant, but as they began to show and were visibly pregnant, everybody said, "This is shocking. we can't have pregnant women giving out communion." Like, can you see the ridiculous way we used to think? That obviously these women had sex, so obviously they're married, hopefully, and are carrying a child, carrying new life. And the parish was saying, they were told not to give out communion anymore, that they couldn't be ministers of the Eucharist until after they had had their child. Now, isn't this an extraordinarily mixed up, incongruous way of thinking about life?